Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. Here we go again, Raja. So there is a bit more I can add to the warm intros that were made. Is I interviewed Raja in the first season of Giant Chips podcast, and one of the things that struck me beyond what was mentioned was, despite having a very successful career, very successful entrepreneurial exit, he decided to start yet another company in one of the world's most toughest industries, chips, and that too a little shade under 65. Just think about it. IVP Semi got founded just under 65. No? More. Look at that. Look at that. So, no better person to talk about chips and semiconductors and deep tech than Raja, because not only does his decision bring the conviction that he has on the industry and India's future in it, and more importantly, the importance of chips, semiconductors, and deep techs as an industry. So, welcome, Raja.
Thank
It is
you.
an honor
Thank you.
to do this session. So, let me start with a big picture question for you, right? Fast forward 20 years. Semiconductors becoming such an important segment of the industry, right? What makes you think at that point in time, or what would be true to say that semiconductors were one of the most consequential industries to invest in at this point in time?
I mean, there's no question about this, right? It's a very foundational thing, right? It's an infrastructure. It's not a luxury that one would have. And my belief is, the last 50 years or maybe 60 years, I was with Texas Instruments. I would say that this is my 46th year. I think Sir said he was 36 years. I'm 46 years in the industry, only in semiconductor. And we're just scratching the surface, in my opinion. The next 20 years will certainly, where will play a huge role, how we use, how we live, and solve a lot of the problems that we have created in the last 100 years or so. So I think whoever is investing in this, they're going to see innovation. They're going to see fulfillment in their lives. I think it's not only just for money, but it's just life changing.
Yeah, and when you look at it, you've been with Texas. Semiconductors have existed for a long time, and they were literally invisible up until very recently, when it became just front and center in terms of national security, geopolitics, and so on and so forth. It just became front and center again, most recently with the Iran war. So what really changed, you think?
I think, when I joined the semiconductor industry, it was very nascent, right? It was just starting. We were basically designing individual transistors. We used to lay out individual transistors. And then, it went through this whole thing about with the tools and all that. Now you're putting billions and billions. But kind of, the software guys, I always call them the highway robbers, right? The downstream people, kind of take over the foundation, right? We were the foundation, right? We were never recognized. But we were doing the hard work, right? I think semiconductor is hard, right? I always say it's hard and it's also very hard.
Yeah.
But I think what has happened is in the last, I would say, 10 years or so, thanks to all the innovation that has happened, whether it's in AI or in military uses and so forth, it has become a very important part, and you might call it weaponization, right, and so forth. And I think the country, as a country like India, for example, right, we're a large country. We actually are a very neutral country as well. So I think from a geopolitical standpoint as well, we have a very important role to play globally. And we being a very benign country in that sense, right? I think most of the countries around the world will trust us as well. So I think semiconductor being the foundation of all of this, right? I think it opens up a lot of opportunities. I mean, everybody knows, right? Drones are the flavor now, right? Everybody wants to make a drone. So I think, it's a very, very key foundational stuff. And not only for our daily use, but as well as for security and so forth. So, and I think for India, getting to this table, semiconductor table, is very, very critical, because I think we will bring some common sense, we will bring the neutrality, and people, the trust generally for Indian product is much, much higher than any other country, especially now with all that is going on geopolitically.
Agreed. Very well said. And to that end, and some of the previous keynote speakers talked about it, there is a lot of investment going in to semiconductor industry in India, more recently as well. And people talk about fabs and billions of dollars. But what do people underestimate or get wrong in terms of building a semiconductor ecosystem and what it takes?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very, very important question. There's a lot of scaremongering in this, right? Anytime you talk about semiconductor, people talk about a billion. And not only 1 billion, but tens of billion. So, we can't do it and so on, right? I think the way semiconductor has been built in the last 40, 50 years, right? From like a TI, which was very vertically integrated. We had made equipment. The whole ecosystem was within a company. And then it went through this fragmented supply chain and knowledge. So now you got to touch so many people, so many different companies in order to make a chip. And now what I believe is, and there was scaling, right? You need to have scale. You need to have 5 fabs in order to make it cost efficient and so on. And I think, it works very well, for countries that are controlling the money and so forth. I think we are going through a phase where there is going to be distributed everything, right? Distributed production of power, how we transmit and how we store, just from a power standpoint. Everything else will also go through this distributed way of doing things. So, I've done some economic, analysis of this. You don't need a multi-billion. The idea is, how do you utilize a multi-billion-dollar fab? That is the toughest thing to do. Whereas, if you have a fab that is, producing much lesser wafers, or maybe even 8-inch wafers, so you could, build a lot less with the and India is very well known, for our frugality in how we manage, new projects. I think ISRO is a classic example. We can repeat that same thing in the semiconductor. So we did not follow the same thing that was done by the US or the European countries. We will have our own way of doing it. And that is where I think, we're talking to the governments as well, did not follow what was done in the last 40, 50 years. We have a clean slate. We can start our own journey.
And you want to highlight some of the segments that you are focused on towards that cause to prove that hypothesis?
Yeah, so IVP, my company, we pick power, right? And foundational products, right? IGBTs, MOSFETs, gate drivers, very simple, what we call catalog products, right? You need the processor, you need the NVIDIA stuff, you need the camera processors, but you also need all these foundational products. So we picked that because one of the less complicated, very well-defined product. You can replace, very quickly, a foreign company's product and so forth. So we picked that. And, to put we're right in the middle of doing a proposal for a fab, for a $350 to $400 million fab, 8-inch fab. You could cover probably 20, 30% of India's need for these power products. And they go into renewable energy, they go into, the electrification, mobility and so on. So we are taking an approach where you learn how to walk before we run. And this will give you all the ecosystem once you put this, somewhere, wherever, we decide to put it. And, the ecosystem will start to build around it. And that is how you build that, right? And, India will scale much faster than many other countries because we just have the capability in terms of people and innovation that can happen.
And maybe a follow-on question related to that, where you talked about distributed everything, is how you are looking at it. And every few years, every generation comes to a point where the global landscape resets. I think the Seafund founders talked about .com. That was definitely one of them. And you come to this age. Why might this be, according to you, the best time for India to build a semiconductor ecosystem like it has never before had?
I believe, it's not, as I mentioned, right, it is not a luxury. Right? It is a need. It's a need for India, and I think it's a need for globally as well. So I would say that, how we do it, how quickly we do it, and, like the space industry, right, there is certain amount of government involvement in it, but really the private sector has to step up. Even today, right, we see it's still very government led, right? The private sector still has not stepped up, and I think that there's a lot more awareness and education that we need to provide. But certainly, I was in Coimbatore, a couple of weeks ago. They're very good on the mechanical stuff and so on, right? So I was talking to some of the industrialists there and said, look, what would be for the next generation, for the next 2-3 decades, right? You need to seed, and semiconductor is a good thing to go seed in that area so that you move on from what you're really good at and now to the next industry. So I think that kind of approach, where the private sector really needs to step up, is where I think the gap is.
Yeah, I agree, and a lot is changing. Like the event we are in today, I am very hopeful that industry steps up along with the government. And probably a more specific question in that regard is, a 25-year-old brilliant engineer comes to you and asks you or tells you that I want to build a semiconductor company out of India. Where would you ask the person to look, and where would you ask the person not to look?
Well, a 25-year-old come and seeing a 70-year-old. So I'm 70 in 2 weeks from now.
There you go.
So, so he came to the right place he's looking at the right guy. I would say, it's exciting that a 25-year-old wants to do this versus doing some Zomato, Komato or something like that. So that is pretty exciting for me. It is a very hard thing to do, but it's your very fundamental, it's about physics, it's about mathematics, it is about, a lot of exciting things, right? So I would say that, just like I was encouraged when I joined TI, I think there's lots and lots of opportunities, with the, even within India, right? I would say, focus on working with, institutions like, Indian Institute of Science and IITs and so forth. But also, there are, startups like us. We are also looking for not just be a follower, but also pick up a few things and lead, right? So that could be one area that, they want to be excited about. And, unlike software, right? And by the way, I'm very biased to hardware, okay? Unlike software, you need a lot of a tinkering mind, a little bit of hands-on tinkering mind. It's not like, just coding and stuff like this. So I would encourage, that there's a lot of excitement in this tinkering type of thinking. And there's a lot of money to be made, if you're a 25-year-old, you also want to think about how to make money. And this is a good place to make money as well.
Yeah. Agree. And a large part of building semiconductor industries is talent. And India is not short on talent. We are sitting in one of country's most premier and maybe one of the world's most premier research institutions. So what you believe has to change for such research to become or convert itself into globally relevant semiconductor and deep tech company? Because that's one of the reasons why I started this podcast also, because despite spending time in large organizations, MNCs as included, I saw a big gap for the talent of 20% chip designers in the world versus globally relevant semiconductor and deep tech companies built out of India.
I always have this argument about talent. If India, if you question the talent in India, right, forget about all the other countries. So, we have massive talent. There is no question. And the more I explore, whether it's IIT Madras or, all these big institutions, and even some private sector, right? They are doing some really good research. The problem I see is the industry is not coming and visiting these research. And, because just the mindset for the industry to do R&D is, sad to say, it's not there, right? So unless they get excited, right? I mean, I was working, for Tata for a short time. Hopefully there's no Tata guys around here. I wish the Tata chairman spends maybe, a couple of days in a month, visiting and sitting down with some of these profs and, looking at some of these doctorates and say, hey, get very excited about it, right? So I believe that, we have a lot of, hidden gems inside, which needs to see the light of the day. And industry needs to come in and pick it up and put some money behind it, put some, good people behind it, and take it. I mean, this is how, US is doing.
Agree.
TI, we used to have, UT as one of our, mainstay for research. We used to cycle people around, through the university schemes and so forth. We made fellows out of them. How many big industries, we have who've got fellows, right? And fellows not just for the namesake, but, who are actually, guiding the company to a product and so on. So I think those are the things that are missing. We have everything here, right? I was, GAN is a good example, right? There's a good research here in GAN. IIT Madras has some good GAN. We don't need to go figure out to go buy GAN technology from somewhere else. Our guys have been doing it for 25, 30 years, right? You give them an opportunity, right? We can build our own GAN products, right? They've done a lot of deep research.
So before I head down to a couple of questions related to clear call to action to the audience here, I want to ask you a bunch of rapid fire questions, just for fun, right? You guys are okay with that? Okay. So the first one, Raja, what's more likely to happen first? India wins the Cricket World Cup again, or India builds the globally dominant semiconductor company we are always looking for?
Yeah. Good man. I'm also a cricket fan, but I'm more of a semiconductor guy than cricket. I would say that, 2-3 years ago, I wouldn't believe it. By nature, I'm a very optimistic person. I believe we're going to create a semiconductor top one, at least one in the top 10 in the next 10 years.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Cheers to you, and cheers to all the innovators in the country. Second question, what's one thing India is better at than the world truly realizes?
Say again?
What's the one thing that India is better at than the world truly realizes?
I think, you see, there's a lot of, Indians are, by nature, right, we're very restless people, right? We always want to do something better than, what is already existing, right? Whether it's Band-Aid thing or, something of immense change. So I think, we don't get the recognition as much. And you can see that, we thrive in an environment which gives you that opportunity. So I believe that, we, and one of the reasons I also think that why a lot of these multinational companies in semiconductor don't bring manufacturing to India, because I think they're worried that once they bring manufacturing to India, we'll become better than better than them. I think there's a mafia behind it. But so I think this is something that the world doesn't realize, but I think we are very good at it.
Okay. If semiconductors were a Bollywood movie, what genre would it be?
It'll be in the Godfather kind of words. And I'll tell you why. Okay? If you see all the top 10, very successful, highly profitable semiconductor companies, right? They ask for government money, right? They have enough money, right? Do you need to give Micron money to build your factory? They're a very, very wealthy company, but they ask for land, right? So mafia always asks for land. They ask for money, right? They extort, right? They say, okay, I'll only sell to you. I won't sell to you, right? So Every aspect of mafia is there in semiconductor. So you can make a Godfather movie out of these guys.
One overused phrase in semiconductors. Last question.
I would say, I really don't know. Sorry, I can't.
Okay, we'll pass on that. So, bringing back to the conversation, right? There are investors in this room and innovators as well. The investor community may not build a chip company themselves in most cases, unless they choose to do that. But what's the meaningful way they can contribute towards building this ecosystem?
I think, I think this is a very, very relevant question. Semiconductor companies are built by passionate, smart, but a lot of passion. They believe in what they do, right? Whether you take Qualcomm or Broadcom or Nvidia or Intel, all the companies were built by not by business people. It was built by an MIT guy or the guys were just passionate about what they researched on, and they said, hey, this is going to work and so forth, right? So it is always built by very smart, passionate people about this. So put the money behind these guys. The moment you bang on the business people, the first question they ask is, what is IRR? What is ROI? What is this? What is that, right? So, this poor kids who were, very passionate about this, they built a Jensen Huang, right? They believed in him, they put money behind it. He went almost bankrupt, right? If you look at Nvidia, right? They went almost bankrupt. And then, they was fortunate that, the GPU became the engine for AI, right? So now, that's, he has taken flight on that. So every case, you look at Qualcomm, it's the same thing, right? It's a couple of, professors, and then they did the CDMA and so on, right? It was not a business, no, it was not some big company or something which was already in the business that created Qualcomm. So that's the difference.
Great answer. And yeah, last question. I think we are out of time. Maybe a snippet of what you think is fast forward 10 years. What must have happened for us to say that India became a semiconductor and deep tech nation?
I think there is an acceleration from the government side, certainly. I think new frontiers like the space and all that, right, requires again, right. We're talking about 6G now. So I think while we are building that ecosystem from the foundation up, we can accelerate a lot of this. We can accelerate through investment from private sector, from joint ventures and so on. Be very open about it. And I believe that our neutrality as a country also will help, because people will trust that the products that we make will be made available to them. It will not come with any conditions and so forth. And in general, right, the products we make will address humanity's problems. Today's, if you see, right, if I work for big companies, and the first question they'll ask is, how much profit are we going to make in this product? If it doesn't meet that particular profit criteria, right, you will not. I think Indian companies will look at it differently. Is it going to save, 1 million lives? So the way they would look at would be a lot different. That is why I say, when India gets into semiconductor, it will really benefit globally. And not necessarily just the people who have got money, but people who really need a change for them to survive.
Fantastic place to close, Raja. You are a true inspiration to all of us. A round of applause for Raja.